Hey, welcome in everyone. 1 month has gone, Groundhog's Day has gone, Super Bowl has gone, days and weeks have gone, but we are always here every week for you. Maybe not about 2025, well, a little bit when it comes to football, but about the 70s. As you know by now, this is another episode of That 70s Pod with Andrew here in Orlando, Bryan Lee in Wisconsin. Um, I'm just going to kick it off by throwing it to you. As I say every week, Brian, how are you on this fine Tuesday evening?
Well, it's been a busy week where I work. So Andrew, thank you for giving me a chance to just come home and decompress a little bit before we started recording. As we're going through a cold stretch in Wisconsin right now, with temperatures reaching 10, 12 below uh, overnight, and during the day it doesn't get much above zero, and going to continue that way for the next 3 or 4 days.
Last week's episode, we talked about the lost candy of the 70s, or candy that you don't really see on shelves anymore, but a lot of them have been making a comeback. Within this past week of you working at the store, being out shopping, have you seen anything or like noticed, like, oh, look, there it is, like candy wise?
I thought about that one day that I should go up front and see what we have at the checkout registers. And then I got sidetracked by a manager or a customer or something, and and forgot about it and never did get up front to look. Um, but I stand by what I said last week that some of the best candy bars are no longer made, like the Marathon bar. Although you said there's something called the Curly Whirly, and I've never really seen that around the upper Midwest, so maybe that's a southern state thing. And then that milkshake bar, which we will never see again because that company no longer exists. Um, but that was a fun episode. I enjoyed talking about candy and uh, and the Reggie Jackson bar. I don't know if we talked about the Reggie bar. I don't know if we clarified it was about Reggie Jackson.
Yeah.
So if we missed that detail, we apologize. And the Hank Aaron bar, the Baby Ruth bar, and all the other wonderful, wonderful candy bars. That was a fun episode to do. And maybe they need to come out with a Jalen Hurts bar now after his successful, very successful performance in Super Bowl 59, in which I accurately predicted that the Philadelphia Eagles would trounce the Kansas City Chiefs.
Did you get a chance to actually watch the game live on Sunday night?
Flipping channels, flipping channels.
Okay. So like how did you win your playoff pool?
All three of them.
Well, congrats on that. And yeah, I was going to bring that up real quick because obviously we talk about like NFL playoffs. I know I said I didn't want to see these two teams in the playoffs, but my girlfriend and I, we watched it. Commercials were so-so. There was like maybe some decent ones. The halftime show, didn't really know any of the music, but it was like production wise, everything, it was shot beautifully. And you called it because I was working out before we recorded, and I listened to our Q&A episode from a few weeks ago, and you said, "Watch, like this is going to be a different game. Like Eagles are going to play differently. They're just stronger. Their offensive line is no joke. Like all four of those guys. Speaking of like purple people eaters and no name defense, like the Philly offensive line is really impressive. And you know what? I'm not going to be all conspiracy theory, but a lot of people throw the whole referees helping Kansas City whenever Kansas City has a home game. So if they're not at home and so and so they're not getting help, that kind of showed what Kansas City was all season long. Because I paid attention. They were not that great of a team this year. They won a lot of like a touchdown or a field goal like type things. Yeah, they had a good record, don't get me wrong. Like they were number one seed, but yeah, it definitely they got kind of lucky against the Bills and exposed against the Eagles. It was actually a decent game. But as good as the Chiefs are, I will say that another like side of my mouth, I never got comfortable watching the game because I was like, they could come back any moment. They could start making this happen, like in the third or fourth quarter. But not an Eagles fan, but I am happy for the Eagles. Um, we Speaking of sweets and at the store, I want to get like pizza and wings and stuff for the Super Bowl. Have you seen these Oreos, Post Malone Oreos?
I have seen them, yeah. I have not tried them yet. Being a diabetic, it looks like something that would make my foot fall off.
I'm almost embarrassed of like how good these are and how like I've been craving them. It's like a salted caramel swirl with the shortbread cookie, and so like one side's vanilla cookie, one side's chocolate cookie with caramel inside. Post Malone, the music artist with the tattoos on his face. These are like one of the best Oreos I've had in a really long time, and been really craving cookies recently. We do have cookies that you can get in our sponsors below in the description. Go support your local Girl Scout troops, by the way. It's that time of year where they're selling cookies. And but yeah, good Super Bowl, good sweets, good snacks all the way around. And you mentioned Reggie Jackson. The first time I saw Reggie Jackson was at that candy bar, was in I've always heard of him, but the first time I saw him was in a comedy movie called The Naked Gun. Right? That was Reggie Jackson? Okay, so his watch goes off and he's trying to kill the queen. And that was such a funny movie for me when I finally saw that, Leslie Nielsen. And you told me, oh, look at Leslie Nielsen, his facial expressions and everything. But he wasn't always like that. Back when he was a really serious actor the first time I saw him, and he did a lot of dramas and stuff. And then he got known for comedy. So I'm using this long Reggie Jackson segue into today's topic where we are going to talk about comedy. We're going to talk about well, I guess actors as well, but stand-up comedians. Because I was just watching a Saturday Night Live special on YouTube where George Carlin was the host of the first episode of Saturday Night Live, and how you were like that was like the main focus of the 70s. And we're going to talk about George Carlin, I suppose. But yeah, today's topic, we're going to get away from candy bars, get away from football. We are going to talk about stand-up comedians. If I had to ask you right off the bat, number one, favorite stand-up comedian in the 70s, who was it for you?
Steve Martin.
And did you were you able to listen to him in high school or did your parents like forbid that?
Um, my parents didn't really they didn't really monitor what I listened to or what I watched, which is fine. I mean, I think they trusted what I was doing, and not that any of these stand-up comedians on television anyway were real outrageous. Of course, if you went to a live show, if you went to a club to see a comedian back in the 70s, then that's a little different story. That's where language was a little looser, content was maybe a little questionable. Um, and if you bought their albums, certainly a lot of that would maybe have a lot of those albums back in the 70s would maybe have some things that you really shouldn't be listening to. So, but I never bought an album other than Steve Martin's Wild and Crazy Guy, which was his second album. Comedians put out albums back in the 70s. That was kind of a big deal. Um, you mentioned George Carlin. He put out a lot of albums. Very funny man, Bob Newhart. Now, most people know Bob Newhart as an actor, but he did a lot of stand up comedy, and he put out albums. So did Bill Cosby. We're not going to talk a lot about Cosby because of his problems later in years, but he put out a lot of albums before comedic albums before people knew him as an actor. And that's how a lot of actors got started, Andrew, was doing stand up. And then in the 70s, when Saturday Night Live came along and the outfit in Chicago that I or Mad TV and SCTV and there was another show that rivaled Saturday Night Live in the 70s. It was called Fridays, and that would be on Friday nights, and that's where the wonderful comedian actor that played Kramer in Seinfeld got his start. I can't think of his name right now. Bob Richards, is that what his name is? Um, that played Kramer. But anyway, so stand-up comedy was an avenue for a lot of actors that went into sitcoms, that wound up getting talk shows. Letterman, Leno, Joan Rivers, they were all stand-up comedians that wound up getting their own talk shows. So stand-up comedy has got so much, such a broad avenue, or just a very just a lot of different things you can do. And we're also going to talk a little bit about my college best friend Steve Gelder, who also was a stand-up comic for many years. He started out in radio and went into comedy, and and he told his high school counselor, "I want to be a comedian." Um, and this was a guidance counselor, and that was supposed to tell them where to go to college and stuff. And my friend Steve walks in and says, "I want to be a comedian." And so the guidance counselor says, well, maybe you should start in radio. So that's why he started as a radio broadcaster, and eventually he did get into comedy. And right now has been in Hollywood for years, doing many projects, plays, writing, directing. So um, again, stand-up comedians have a lot of doors open for them, and we're going to talk about some of the best of the '70s. That was a really long answer, Andrew. I'm sorry, but I have a list of names here of people I watched, people I thought was funny. The wonderful Andy Kaufman, of course, the insane humor of Robin Williams, which turned him into a major star. Steve Martin would be in that category. There was also some sad stories of comedians like Freddie Prinze, who later died at a very young age. Um, just so many people to talk about, Andrew. So you go ahead and tell me which way you want me to go.
Well, when we first talked about this episode was my idea, and the first thing you were like, "All right, let me do some research on it," and I'm like, "Huh, I wonder what research he's gonna do." Unless you were just kind of unless you were just reminding yourself of certain comedians and their albums. But the first one, I always hear that people first taste of a stand-up comedian is someone who is like past their time, right? So the first time I ever saw a stand-up comedian, if you go in our archive, we did an episode about Johnny Carson, and we had a VHS tape of Johnny Carson where it was like the clips, and I want to say it was Steve Martin who had like this opera singer, I think like a puppet of an opera singer like stick out of his zipper. Does this sound familiar?
Yeah, yeah, no, you're correct.
Okay, so like I remember seeing Steve Martin and then Sam Kinison. Um, Obviously they weren't. Well, I guess they were. Steve Martin was still kind of doing stuff in the '90s, but that was like I saw old footage of a guy being funny, and that's the first time I saw it. It wasn't anything current. It was something before my time, and for the longest time I thought Sam Kinison and Meatloaf were the same guy. That took me years. That took me years to try to figure that out. But was your first stand-up comedian somebody who wasn't like on TV anymore? Like what? Because obviously Jack Benny. Like, was that like kind of your first taste of it? Somebody like that?
Well, that's a really great question, Andrew, and there's two of them that come to mind right off the bat. The first one was a guy named Red Skelton. And you probably have no idea who Red Skelton is, but when I was like 5 years old, this was in the '60s actually. Um, I used to impersonate Red Skelton because I thought this guy was so funny, and he used to dress up as this character called Freddie the Freeloader, and Freddie the Freeloader was a bum, who lived on the streets, and this was on a variety show in the '60s. And so I would put on this bathrobe, and I found this old hat, and I had the glasses with the nose. I don't know where I even got those from, and I would walk around, and there somewhere in, I don't know where, whatever happened to it, but there's a picture of me as a 5-year old dressed up like Freddie the Freeloader, um, portrayed by me impersonating Red Skelton, and it's in black and white. And I don't know if I have that photo or not, but that was my first exposure to a stand-up comedian. And my second one would be Bob Hope. Now you've probably heard of Bob Hope. He used to do TV specials 2 or 3 times a year. He did a lot of touring with the USO, performing for our troops in Vietnam. And he used to have college football specials where he would introduce the college football players of the year. Bob Hope was a very, very funny stand up comedian. My dad's favorite comedian, even though my dad didn't like the fact that Bob Hope was a Republican. Not that, in fact, my dad would say that every time he saw Bob Hope, that yeah, I really like that guy. He's funny. The only problem is he's a Republican, and I had no idea what he was even talking about. But anyway, those were my first two at a very very young age. Andrew, Red Skelton and Bob Hope were the two stand up comedians I remember being exposed to at a very very young age.
That's an interesting how I am familiar with those two guys because of you. And they both had to do with Christmas in my mind because the first time I had my own money to buy a Christmas gift for my mom and my dad, obviously you, there was a local store called Pomida. And for some reason, I remember you or our grandma or somebody pointing out a picture of this guy dressed like a hobo. And it's like, oh, that was your dad's favorite comedian growing up. And that's all I knew. This guy that looked like a hobo was your favorite comedian. You're like, like Jim Carrey, but that's what this guy was. And so I was like, oh, okay. So at Pomida, I found like a VHS or a DVD of the best of Red Skeleton. And I got that for you for Christmas one year. And then Bob Hope, all I ever hear about him is how he went to the overseas on Christmas Day to perform for the troops. And that was something during that 70s show, actually, like what this podcast is kind of tribute after, like Red Foreman, the dad on that show, saying like I was in a lot of pain, but like man, that Bob Hope made me laugh, like on Christmas Day when I was overseas. And it's just like that was I always heard of Bob Hope, Red Skeleton, and then as I mentioned earlier, Jack Benny. So was that kind of something where when I was a kid and I would see Steve Martin on Sergeant Bilko, I didn't get it. It was funny, but like I didn't get it. And then I see Jim Carrey on Dumb and Dumber or Ace Ventura, and he's just like all over the place throwing himself on the ground. And like that was like physical comedy. That was funny. So if you were a fan of Red Skeleton, did you did it make more sense later? Or was it just humor all around, like at a young age for you?
Well, with Red Skeleton, not skeleton, but skeleton. Uh, get right. Um, yeah, it was his characters. He used to. I mentioned Freddy the Freeloader, where he was dressed up like a bum. He would also impersonate two seagulls. Where he would put his thumbs under his arms and just start talking in this weird voice, like two seagulls, two seagulls, and and I don't even remember what the jokes were, but it was um, I guess you could call it slapstick, even though he wasn't like a John Ritter who was wonderful on Three's Company, who would do lots of falling, or Dick Van Dyke back on the Dick Van Dyke Show. He was wonderful with slapstick. And then later, as you mentioned, Jim Carrey. So it was kind of like with Red Skelton, it was the characters he created. With Bob Hope, it was more, even though a lot of his humor went over my head because he had a lot of political humor, but he maybe I thought it was funny because my dad thought it was funny. My dad would laugh at it, so I knew it was funny, even though I didn't really know why. But I knew he was telling jokes, and some of the things I understood. Most of it went over my head, but in later years when I got older, Bob Hope was around and performing for a long, long time. before he passed away. I think he lived till 93, and he was still performing in his 80s. Just a funny man, and he also did a lot of movies with Bing Crosby back in the 50s and 60s. He and those two and Dorothy Lamour, and they just had some wonderful movies, and they were funny, and he just continued that. Uh, George Burns is another one. He performed. Um, I don't know if he performed until he was 100. He lived until he was 100, but I know he was still performing in his 90s. So uh, these are all people I was exposed to at a young age, but more into the mid 70s, and especially watching Johnny Carson, Andrew, the young comedians that Johnny Carson would give an opportunity to. If you made the Johnny Carson show, the Tonight Show, you were doing something. You were big time, especially if Johnny called you over to the desk after you did your 5 6 minutes. You were doing something, and that's where I saw for the first time a lot of these people like Freddie Prinze and Andy Kaufman and Richard Pryor and and Steve Martin. And Saturday Night Live became another avenue for comedians that I'd never really heard of before. Steve Martin was a staple on those early episodes of Saturday Night Live, doing bits with Belushi and Aykroyd and all those guys in their own right were stand-up comedians. Again, the Saturday Night Live cast was more skits and slapstick type stuff. Um, but a lot of those people were comedians as well. Eddie Murphy went on to have a huge career as a comedian, movie person, and there's just so many. But we're going to try to stick to the 70s on this show because if we start talking Eddie Murphy and Sam Kinison, those were more in the 80s. So we want to stick to the 70s.
So like you answered my next question of like what was your introduction? Was it radio? Was it TV? And it sounds like Johnny Carson was a big deal. Because like for me it was you would listen to KS95 or K102 on the radio. And I remember you and my older brother Brett, you would listen to, oh, they had like this comedian on, this comedian on. We have to buy the cassette, we have to buy the VHS tape. And actually seeing for the first time, it was a comedian named Jeff Foxworthy. His special, Totally Committed. We went to Pizza Hut and then we went to Walmart to buy this Jeff Foxworthy VHS tape, which sounds like such a hillbilly of a sentence. And like it was, but he was a whole redneck was his shtick. I just saw Jim Gaffigan in theaters, on live, the start of January, and his whole shtick is about like food, you know. And so what was Bob? I guess I'm curious. What was Bob Hope's like material?
Well, he had really good writers. Um,
Okay.
some of his material was his, but he also had good writers. And Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of his stuff was political.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of it was current events. Um, when he was actually a little bit of a risk taker because he would go overseas and perform for our troops wherever they were, Korea, Vietnam, uh, wherever they were stationed, and do a show, and and he would bring up like maybe a foreign leader, do some kind of a slam on a foreign leader, or maybe even the current president, whoever that may be at the time, and or a general, or um, somebody the troops would know, and sometimes it was inside humor, but basically all he was doing was making the troops laugh because they had a very serious job, a very important job. So, he was just trying to make them for a couple hours forget about where they were, who they were, and just laugh. What maybe the joke was inappropriate, maybe it was politically motivated, maybe it was a something that was out of context, or something that was in bad taste, but his purpose was just to make them laugh and have a good time. And and I think everybody in that realm was okay with that. So Bob Hope had wonderful comedic talent and timing, and he performed really well. And his material might not have always been agreeable, but people were okay with that because his ultimate goal was making our troops laugh, and they needed that because they were stationed overseas, away from their families, fighting in wars, and they needed a couple of hours just to forget about that and laugh.
And there are still comedians to this day that they kind of talk about current news and politics, and that's just kind of their shtick. You mentioned Skelton, right? Red Skelton, is that how you say it?
Yeah, not skeleton, but skeleton.
Skelton. Oh, he did characters. You weren't a Dana Carvey fan, but Dana Carvey always did characters, and he would do like impressions and all. I gotta just ask this before I forget it. 70s, have you ever heard the comedian, speaking of characters, the comedian named Von Meter, who did an impression of JFK?
No, no.
Okay, because apparently, like, skyrocketed. Like, picked one thing, did JFK all the time, and then after the assassination, um, like his career like just tanked. Like he had nothing after that because he felt like he couldn't do it anymore. But that was definitely a thing of like, that's my shtick. I'm doing characters, but then he couldn't go out, he couldn't record. Earlier, you mentioned about recording and doing albums. Who was like the first? What was like the first like comedian like album that you remember? Or who was the first of all time? Was it someone in the 70s or was it prior to the 70s?
Well, yeah, in the '60s, like I said, Bill Cosby, Bob Newhart, they were doing albums in the '60s.
Okay.
Uh, who was first? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Um, but that caught on in the '70s. Uh, George Carlin had albums. Richard Pryor had albums. Steve Martin had at least three that I remember, maybe more. Robin Williams' very first album was Reality. What a concept! Which I did not own, but I do remember seeing that. The only comedy album I owned, like I said earlier, was Steve Martin's second album, which was called Wild and Crazy Guy. Um, I did hear his first album. Somebody lent that to me in high school, um, and I don't even remember what that album was called now. But it was basically Steve Martin doing comedy in clubs, and you can tell that comedians back in those days, they didn't perform in a huge arena. Although Steve Martin got so popular, Andrew, that he started performing in arenas. And when I was a junior in high school, I remember my friend Kirk Tingblad, who we've talked about before, who went on to work for Disney and create Johnny Bravo. He went to Steve Martin's show at the St. Paul Civic Center and said it was sold out. And to me, that was just unfathomable that a comedian, not a rock group, um, which in the '70s for a rock group to sell out the St. Paul Civic Center, like the Rolling Stones or Kiss or whatever, that was commonplace. But for a comedian to sell out a 17,000 seat arena, and Steve Martin was doing this all over the country, where most comedians would do clubs, and that's how they started. All of a sudden, Steve Martin is selling out arenas because the comedy he was doing was so crazy. And I look back on it now and I'm going, that's not even really funny. But in the '70s, it was funny. It was funny on the Tonight Show. It was funny on Saturday Night Live, and apparently it was funny enough to sell a lot of albums and sell out major arenas, and that's what Steve Martin was doing.
Was it this album, Steve Martin, Let's Get Small?
Yes, yes. Let's get small, and all of the all of the content on that album is just him working local clubs in the Los Angeles area, and the humor is he plays the banjo on it. He's a very skilled banjo player. He always has been. Um, the comedy on that album, a lot of drug induced stuff. Not that he was doing drugs, but it was a lot of drug humor. And in the '70s, that was kind of what was going on. You know, there was a lot of that um, pot smoking. Uh, People had bongs and had I didn't know anybody that was doing hard stuff like heroin, but most people I knew smoked pot and had bongs, and I don't really even know what a bong does. I know what they look like. I've seen people use them, um, but but a lot of the humor of Steve Martin, Robin Williams, certainly George Carlin, were kind of drug related humor type things. Um, where maybe some other comedians just relied on straight humor. There was a guy named Steve Landesberg. Who later got a gig on Barney Miller, a TV show, and Steve Landesberg had wonderful dry humor, and he could stand and just captivate you for an hour and a half with his humor. It was just so dry and sarcastic. He was really good. Um, and of course, I can't forget Rodney Dangerfield. Oh, who better than Rodney Dangerfield, who fired joke after joke after joke? Basically, they weren't long jokes. They were all, like 10-second jokes, but he would rapid fire these jokes, whether it was on Carson. He'd come out and do 5, 6 minutes on Carson, and then he'd go over and talk to Johnny and do another 6, 7 minutes of just joke after joke after joke. And Rodney Dangerfield, probably one of the funniest guys that I remember watching on TV, because his humor was so fast and so quick and so smart. And even if one joke failed, it didn't matter because he was already on to the next one. So Dangerfield was so good, and probably the epitome of what stand-up comedy was in the '70s.
That's actually, I'm so glad you brought that up because that's what I was talking about shtick, right? Like he had his red tie and no respect. And like that was it. And like that was his thing. And people just wanted to see how he was going to build off his no respect. He had his Dr. Vinny Boombox, and then he always had something about his dog or his kid, or like just, oh, let's hear it for the band. Let's play the trumpet. Like the fact that kind of like Jeff Foxworthy, like the redneck thing, and like the fact that Rodney Dangerfield and like Mitch Hedberg, like two people that just understood it like so differently. And that's why I feel like the '70s was you needed like your happy people, your no respect people, but then you kind of needed your little dangerous people. I know not Dangerfield, but speaking of albums, I've been the reason I want to do this episode so I can talk about the album Class Clown by George Carlin. Do you have this album?
No, I didn't own anything by George Carlin, but um, his most famous bit was the 7 words you can't say on television.
That's this
And
album.
yeah, yeah, and that's kind of what put him on the map. Um, and I've seen the bit. Um, it's not my favorite George Carlin bit by any means, because he had really insightful humor. He was kind of ahead of his time, Andrew. I think you've seen the bit where he talks about the difference between baseball and football.
Yeah.
And, in baseball, you have errors. In football, you have penalties. And he just kind of goes through, every time he talks about baseball, he kind of uses, this um, wimpy type voice, like in baseball you have a bunt, in football you have a nose guard or whatever it is, and he basically dishes baseball and glorifies football, And I think when Carlin does stuff like that, to me, that's much more insightful, much more memorable. And Carlin was really a genius with some of the material that he had.
Yeah, he was very crude. I think that's definitely probably one of the first comedy albums that had that parental advisory, like explicit content sticker on it. And then in my generation, it was a guy named Dane Cook who kind of went over the top. And yeah, I'm not big at comedians that want to just curse for no meaning or no reason. George Carlin, kind of had like a method of how he would use his inappropriate terms and curse words. But the only reason I brought that up because we talk about that '70s show. There's that episode where they try to get somebody fired from the radio station. So she plays class clown live and then she loses her job. And I was just like, oh, so funny. Like they're all giggling at like listen to this album. Was that a thing in your high school? That was like my question. Were people aware of this in high school? Or like trying to sneak this? Or like, hey, do you hear about this like album?
I don't remember where I heard it. I remember people talking about it, um, and I think Carlin even tried to do a version of it on TV where he didn't use the words, but you knew the words he was using. Um, but I don't remember for sure if that's right or not. I think maybe he did a couple of the words, or maybe he just kind of teased it. Um, but it was definitely something in the '70s. I mean, you couldn't really say a whole lot. I mean, you didn't even hear hell or damn in the '70s. The rules got much more laid back in the '90s, and even into the late '80s and '90s, and then you were hearing all kinds of things. But in the '70s, you just didn't hear curse words. You didn't hear hell, damn, or stuff like that. So um, uh, yeah, Carlin definitely pushed the pencil. Richard Pryor is another one that kind of pushed the pencil. Um, but his humor was different in the fact that he would tell stories about himself or about Black Americans. He had a wonderful career. He had a lot of personal issues. I get one time he set himself on fire. I don't remember if it was by accident or on purpose, but Richard Pryor had a lot of problems. But God, he was just a funny, funny man and had some good material as well.
Here, but I didn't see these guys back then. Was Flip Wilson, was he kind of the same like vibe?
Flip Wilson, he talked about growing up in the South, and he was more of a positive comedian, not a negative comedian. A lot of Richard Pryor stuff was negative in a funny way, but Flip Wilson was more positive. He would do voice characterizations. He actually had a variety show for a year or two, would where he would dress up like a woman and use like this sassy type voice, and it was very funny. Flip Wilson had, and he put out albums as well in the '60s and '70s, and he had some good stuff. I wasn't a huge fan of him. I watched his variety show because there was nothing else on in that time slot, so I would watch his show. Um, and he had a pretty good following for quite a long time. Another comedian that had, oh man, I don't even know where to start with Don Rickles. Uh, Don Rickles was so insulting to so many different kinds of people. Um, whether it was American or white Americans, Black Americans, Native American, it didn't matter. Don Rickles just criticized everybody. They were hockey pucks. They were dingbats. They were oh man, he had he had so much insults for so many people, and for whatever reason, Don Rickles was hugely popular. Um, he was on. the Dean Martin roast all the time, which the Dean Martin roast, if you remember watching that in the 70s, uh, had it was basically all comedians that got to stand up and roast whoever the person was for that week. I think we were going to do an episode on the Dean Martin roast one time, and we never did do that, did we, Dan? Andrew? Um, but Don Rickles was one of those guys that just made a living by insulting people. He didn't tell stories or jokes. He just insulted people, and 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 people like that. It for whatever reason. I mean, I was okay with it, but I like more smart humor. Um, there was a guy named Gary Shandling that was popular for a while. Yeah, kind of in the same uh, the same family as Jay Leno or David Letterman, or there was another one, David Brenner. They came out. All these guys were staples on Johnny Carson. They all went on to have their own talk shows, and and Shandling was really good. He had some great humor. Talked about growing up, about how you would be eating your bowl of cereal in the morning, and he would say how many people had dads that would come to the table in their boxers and itching their butt, and you're trying to eat your bowl of cereal, and it's like, come on, Dad, I'm trying to eat here. And he had humor you could relate to, because we all had dads like that would walk into the kitchen in their underwear, scratching their butt when you're trying to eat your breakfast cereal. And I know I did. Um, uh, I mean, I had a dad that did that. Andrew, I'd like to hope your dad didn't do that. I don't remember if I did or not. But Shandling had that kind of humor, and it got to be sort of that relational type humor, that people became more interested in. There was a wonderful guy named Stephen Wright, very very funny man, and he talked about that sort of thing all the time. Billy Crystal was another one who started in the 70s and did wonderful impressions of Muhammad Ali and Howard Cosell. And and when you talk about impressions, Rich Little was actually, you talked about that guy earlier, Andrew, that did impersonations of JFK and then had to stop after the assassination. But Rich Little made a career for many, many years. He was on so many variety shows. He toured all over the country doing clubs. He was always on the Dean Martin roast. He was on the Bob Hope specials. Rich Little was the was a human Xerox machine, is what somebody called him once, because he did so many impressions, kind of like a modern day Frank Caliendo. Rich Little did all kinds of impersonations, and they were good. Most of them were dead on. Some of them were a little shaky, but Rich Little was another one. He wasn't that funny, but you watched him because of the impersonations, and he was really good at Jack Benny and Jimmy Stewart and Johnny Carson, and he had a pretty good Nixon. He had a pretty good Gerald Ford. So he did presidents as well. Um, and yeah, I'm glad I thought of him. I forgot all about Rich Little. He was very good.
I've never heard of him, but I'm looking it up, and his cadence and all kind of reminds me of Tim Conway a little bit.
Conway, um, I don't know if Conway ever did stand up comedy. He maybe when he was really young, but he was pretty much a television guy. And again, you talk about slapstick. Conway was really good at it. He was on a show called McHale's Navy back in the early '60s when there was still black and white TV. Later, he was on the Carol Burnett show. Uh, Made a long career doing all kinds of different things. The Smothers Brothers. Uh, were another one. Tom Smothers was hilariously funny. They had a great variety show that introduced people uh, like Steve Martin. He was a regular on the Smothers Brothers in the late '60s, early '70s. Jim Stafford. who was sort of a country music comedian. He did a lot of country music songs uh, that were very funny. Uh, like I don't like spiders and snakes. If you've ever heard that song, and he did stand up comedy with his guitar. One of the funniest things he ever said is uh, he was talking about his cat, and he said cats are a lot like Baptists. You know they're raising hell, but you just can't catch them at it. And and so people like that. Comedy was so pure and so funny in the 70s, and it kind of went into a dark profanity laced direction in the 90s into the 2000s. That's why you got to appreciate people that still kept it clean, like Sinbad. Sinbad is wonderfully funny, and he has straight clean humor for the most part. So does Jim Gaffigan. um, uh, Foxworthy, you mentioned earlier, he wasn't so clean when he first started, but later when he became famous, all his humor was clean, along with Bill Engvall and Larry the Cable Guy. Not Ron White though. He was totally the opposite. But so I like clean comedians. That's what I liked in the 70s. Well, that's all you heard in the 70s, unless you went out and bought an album. Um, and there were no VHS or CDs back then, so you couldn't go watch somebody's live performance. There was no YouTube, so the only thing you had was television and records, because they didn't really play comedians on the radio. So there wasn't much of an avenue, Andrew. It was TV and it was records, and that was it.
So you mentioned Jim Stafford, who is an American songwriter, who kind of did funny songs and all and parodies. I know we did a music episode, and I wanted to try to get into like the music side that was more comedic. Because obviously, Steve Martin had his banjo, right? So he made that part of his act. And then you had Ray Stevens, who that was just an American song. Like he also, I feel like I sound like Google when I say American songwriter anytime I like type their name in. But he would do funny songs and all. So was there anybody else who I'm just not thinking at the moment that kind of like Weird Al, who like made a living off of like using music, but in a comedy setting?
Yeah, there was a guy named um, well, actually, he had two different names, and I don't know which name was the real one. Um, his name was Ben Calder, but he also went by Sheb Woolley, and
Eh.
and he would take mostly country songs. He would take famous country songs, and and much like if you remember Cletus Judd
Yeah.
in the 2000s, that's what this guy, this Ben Kohler, was doing in the 70s. Is he was taking popular country music songs and changing the words, and uh, he did a famous song called "One Eye Purple People Eater," and that got some pretty major airplay. Um, that I think that was his only top 40 hit. Um, but to answer your question, that's the only one I remember. There was maybe more. Um, my dad actually bought an album of this guy, and I listened to it quite a bit. I thought he was pretty funny the way he changed words of popular country music songs.
Did we talk about that one time? Like during our music episode, wasn't there some comedic guy that had a song about what flavor is your gum or something like that?
We maybe talked about something like that. Uh, I don't recall right now because we've talked about so much over the weeks of doing this program. So, um,
But does that
uh,
sound familiar?
yeah, that sounds like something Jim Stafford might have done. Um, yeah, I don't remember exactly what we were talking about now, Andrew. But um, basically, what I wanted to, there were shows there was lots of you talk about country music and a lot of country music had to do with comedy as well. There used to be a show called Hee Haw that my parents used to watch all the time, and a lot of the people on that show, if they weren't musicians, they were stand-up comedians that did the Grand Ole Opry. So comedy kind of went all over the place. It was from Bob Hope to uh, extreme stuff like Robin Williams, who started in the '70s and then got Mork and Mindy. Uh, Steve Martin. There was country comedians. There was Jerry Clowler, who was a very funny guy in country music. Minnie Pearl. Archie Campbell, all those people that were on Hee Haw were stand-up comedians on the Grand Ole Opry. So comedy was a huge part of growing up in the '70s. Uh, it was a lot of TV. Whenever there was a variety show or some kind of a special show, there was always stand-up comedy. So I was exposed to it quite a bit, and thanks to Johnny Carson for introducing new talent. Um, Man, I remember the first time I ever saw Andy Kaufman. He was doing his foreigner bit, and you really believed him. You thought that that's who this guy was, and Carson had him back two or three, four times, and and before you finally learned that no, he wasn't this foreign guy with his weird voice that was afraid of his own shadow. No, he was a normal guy that that could knock an impression of Elvis Presley out of the park. So it took a long time before I figured out that Andy Kaufman was not uh, some weirdo from a foreign country that for some reason was on TV. He was actually a very talented comedian. So when I think back on memories like that, and occasionally I'll Google those old Carson shows and type in Andy Kaufman or Steve Martin or Stephen Wright or Freddie Prinz or something like that, and just watch the bits that they used to do. Letterman used to be a regular on Carson doing his stand up. So was Jay Leno. So was Joan Rivers. And it's fun to go back and watch them as comedians, not what they became, which were maybe Hollywood stars or had their own talk shows. They all started as comedians, Andrew, and it was fun. It's fun to go back now and watch them in the '70s, whether it be on Johnny Carson or some other variety show, because that's how they started. That's who they were, and they become something. They became something greater. But it all started with stand up comedy.
No, I do want to talk about three goofy characters real quick. I'm glad you brought up Andy Kaufman because there's some people we talked about that they use music, and then there's other guys that just stood there in a suit and they would just say witty banter. But Andy Kaufman, like there is something so like smart and like organic but weird at the same time. Because well, a lot of years ago, a movie came out named Borat, and a lot of people thought like this actor Sacha Baron Cohen, like who's this Borat guy? Well, how did he get a movie? And they just kind of thought that was him, like in real life. And then like Andy Kaufman, one of the first things I ever saw of him, besides like the wrestling thing where like he took the pile driver from Jerry Lawler, like obviously I saw that, which was also super clever because again, people bought everything he was doing, that he had this real life heat with the King. But I think it was also Saturday Night Live where he's like this little kid who's all proud to show his parents that he can sing along to a theme song of a TV show, but the only words he knows is like the main chorus. And so he has his record player with the Mighty Mouse theme song, and he's just so proud to say like, "Here I come to save the day" scene or like line, and then he gets all shy. And the first time I saw that, I was like, "Holy cow, this is like genius, like how like clever this is." And he wasn't just being like, I'm on stage and I say funny stuff. Like him, we're going to talk about him a little bit more if you want to. Robin Williams, and then someone that I feel like people forget about a lot, Buddy Hackett, who was just known for like his face. And that was like the funny part of like Buddy Hackett was his facial expression because these are three different guys that took comedian to a whole different level in the 70s.
Well, Buddy Hackett, I don't remember a lot of his stand up, um, but like you said, he had great expressions,
Mhm.
and sometimes that's what a comedian needs is is their body language, the expressions that they make with their face or their eyebrows or their eyes or and Buddy Hackett was really good at that. I don't remember any of his bits or his dialogue, but yeah, you're right that a lot of it was just his body language, and he changed the landscape of stand up comedy because of that, and made it okay to do to use more of your body to be funny. Um, Robin Williams, oh man, he was Robin Williams had no filter when he was first starting out. His first album, Reality What a Concept, was had a rating of R, so you couldn't buy it if you were under 17. You could not buy Robin Williams' album because it was rated R and it had bad language, and parents needed to know that what that album contained was not something that they maybe wanted their kids to listen to. Um, but Robin Williams was insanely funny. Anything anything I ever saw Robin Williams do, whether it was on Carson, Mork and Mindy, the movies he was in, uh, that guy was just on all the time. So sad the way it ended for him, but he had such a desire to perform and make other people happy and make other people forget about their life for a little bit and or their problems or their money troubles or what's going on in the world. Robin Williams just wanted to make people laugh, and he had such a gift. And yeah, even though his material was questionable in the beginning, he did clean it up whenever he was on TV. Well, he had to. So yeah, just certainly a game changer. Robin Williams took stand-up comedy to a whole nother level because of his energy. And who was the third one? I don't remember who the third one was.
We were talking about Andy Kaufman again.
Oh, well, uh, just pure genius. I mean, who would have thought coming on TV, playing this character from another country, and you never even knew what country he was from, that I remember anyway. Um, and and he would tell stupid jokes and do impressions where he wasn't really doing impressions at all. He wasn't changing his voice. He would just say, "And now, Don Rickles, you hockey puck, you're stupid." Like, okay, that's Don Rickles says those things, but that's not how he sounds. Um, and then when he did the Elvis thing, it was like, holy cow, can this guy do an Elvis? And then he went back to the foreigner character after he was done doing Elvis, and finally, after, like I said, 3 or 4 appearances on Carson, he finally said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is who I really am." And then he had an interview with Carson and talked about how he developed the character, and how he would sometimes act like the character on the streets of New York just so people would leave him alone, because they didn't want to come near him. So Kaufman was really a genius, and he was very misunderstood because people didn't understand his humor. But he a very funny guy, and I wish cancer took his life way too early. But it would have been fun to see what Kaufman could have done going into the 80s and 90s.
Speaking of an early death, you mentioned Freddie Prinze earlier. I know nothing about Freddie Prinze, like the original Freddie Prinze.
Well, you know of his son, of course, Freddie
Yeah,
Prinze Jr.
yeah.
Um, Freddie Prinze was he was. he offered a different perspective because being from Latin America, he or being a Mexican American, he had stories growing up from that culture, and that was the first time that I can remember where there was a Mexican American doing stand up comedy, talking about how they grew up, talking about their culture, much like Richard Pryor did, talking about being a Black American growing up. Um, and, uh, and Freddie Prinze just had really good stuff. I can remember him being on Carson, and and he wound up going and getting a TV show called Chico and the Man, uh, with Scatman Carruthers and Jack Albertson, two very talented, experienced Hollywood actors who basically carried the show. But Freddie Prinze played this Mexican American mechanic who worked for Jack Albertson. Again, he died tragically, a very sad thing. Um, and I don't remember all the details behind his death, but Freddie Prinze had a really strong career ahead of him when it came to an end.
Okay, I got two more guys for you and then a question. Did you mention George Burns already? This old guy?
Yeah, we talked about George Burns when we were talking about Bob Hope
That's right.
and Jack Benny, and George Burns in one is in one of my all-time favorite movies called Oh God, with John Denver and Terry Garr, and all those people are dead now. Terry Garr just passing away less than a year ago. A very funny actress who was also in Young Frankenstein and Mr. Mom, many movies over the years. George Burns was in that movie. He played God, and of course, being a John Denver mark, I had to go see the movie. John Denver is very good in his first major motion picture, but working with George Burns made it easy, and he talked about George Burns all the time whenever he did interviews, and they talked about that movie and how wonderful it was to work with a pioneer veteran like George Burns.
And then, were you a fan or even know stuff about Eric Idle?
Uh, I did not. I was not a fan of Monty Python,
Gotcha.
and a lot of I mentioned my good friend from college, Steve Gelder. He had to watch Monty Python every weekend, and other people I went to college with would talk about Monty Python. And I went and seen a Monty Python movie called The Life of Brian, and I thought it was absolutely the stupidest movie that I had ever seen. And you say that to people now, and they're going, "How can you say that? That was brilliant." And no, maybe I just didn't get it. But Monty Python's Flying Circus was something I did not watch. I didn't get it. Now I watched Benny Hill. Benny Hill was an import as well from the United Kingdom, and I thought Benny Hill was very funny. But Monty Python, I just didn't get it.
Was there any other UK or like comedians or overseas that you were a fan of in the 70s?
That Benny Hill was definitely my favorite. I don't really remember if there was any others. Uh, the stuff that I would see on TV, Andrew, would either be on the independent station Channel Two. It wasn't on a major network, or it would be on so late at night, like on a Saturday night at midnight or something like that, where you'd see Benny Hill. So they would put that stuff on at very weird times or on weird channels. So it was hard to build an audience.
And then today there's a comedian I'm a fan of named Jeff Dunham. He's a ventriloquist with puppets. So was that a thing in the 70s? Was there a magician or a ventriloquist or like someone who had like a talented type of theme to the comedy act?
Well, Edgar Bergen, and he was more in the 50s and 60s. Um, he he had a couple of characters. He was kind of the ventriloquist of the day in the 50s and 60s, and um, I've never been a fan of ventriloquism. Um, there was a a TV show in the 70s called Soap, and there used to be a comedian, uh, a ventriloquist on the show. His name, I believe, was Jay Johnson, and and he never talked during the show, but his ventriloquist dummy did all the talking, and and he was very funny. But for the most part, ventriloquist dummies kind of freak me out. I don't really. Maybe it's because of the movie Magic with Anthony Hopkins that was out in the 70s. Um, I never saw the movie, but again, those types of movies freak me out, where dolls or ventriloquist dummies come to life, or mannequins. A Mannequin was a big movie. I think that was maybe in the 80s, but I don't like watching movies like that because I don't like having that get into my subconscious, where objects like that can come to life. Toy Story is something different because that was more comedy based. But although for a while I thought my GI Joes got up and moved at night, but I think it was the dog that was moving them. But Yeah, I didn't. Ventriloquism did, even though I appreciate it for what it was, and I think people like nowadays, you got that girl that was on America's Got Talent, Darcy Lynn. They're very talented in what they can do, but yeah, that was something as a kid that I just didn't care for. That just kind of freaked me out.
Are you so afraid of gnomes, by the way?
Well, I was never afraid of gnomes, but I just don't want to be around them when it's dark out. Uh, and again, I remember um, uh, actually I think I watched the episode with your older brother Brett.
The
There
goosebumps?
in the night, you know where I'm going with this. It was I think it was called our it was either Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark? I think it was Are You Afraid of the Dark? Where these gnomes came to life. And I know it freaked Brett out because whenever we'd go out and deliver papers, if there was a gnome, he wouldn't deliver the paper there. I had to go do it. So neither one of us liked being around gnomes when it was dark out, but during the day, it wasn't a problem.
That makes me laugh so much. And like, I hope this episode made you guys laugh. Um, I was just going to ask you like these three questions, like back real quick. You said Steve Martin was your favorite comedian of all time. Was there a favorite? All funny people. Was there your favorite '70s Saturday Night Live character of all time, like from the '70s? Like, who's the first mind?
Well, again, Steve Martin and Dan Aykroyd used to do something called Two Wild and Crazy Guys.
Okay.
Uh, and they played Czechoslovakian brothers, and it was a funny bit, and you knew whenever Steve Martin was on the show that they were going to do a bit of these brothers, and they did. Um, Steve Martin was so wonderfully talented with what he could do. He had a hit movie out called The Jerk, which was his first movie. He had a hit single with King Tut. He had a top 10 album with Wild and Crazy Guy. I mean, all this happened at the same time, Andrew. I mean, there was nobody that was hotter than Steve Martin around 1978, 1979. I mean, that guy was just on fire. Everything he did was solid gold.
So, well, other than him though, so is Dan Aykroyd your answer?
Oh, character?
Well, from Saturday Night Live, I meant.
Oh, other than Steve Martin.
Yeah.
I thought you said with Steve Martin. I'm sorry. Uh, oh man, from the '70s. Yeah, I really, yeah. It had to. I can't really think of anybody. Um, who I thought was a good reoccurring character on in the 70s anyway. You know, later with Saturday Night Live, of course, you had Wayne's World and and lots of other characters that they actually made movies about. But in the 70s, I don't think there was anybody that really stands out.
What about like a female stand-up comedian from the 70s?
Well, Joan Rivers was probably the main one. And she was kind of like a female version of Don Rickles. She just insulted people. Uh, you know, she if she talked about other actresses or or she talked about her family or she talked about Queen Elizabeth a lot. She was insulting, but it was funny, and her I got her humor. She was I thought she was okay, but she lasted a long time. And again, a very tragic death for her. A number of years, I guess it's been about 15 years ago since she passed away. But yeah, just well, maybe not that long ago, but maybe more like 10 years ago. But she just was there were other female comedians too. Elaine Boozler was really good. Um, I remember one time she came on, and she had lost a lot of weight, and she said that yeah, I've been losing. You probably noticed I've lost weight, and she said I recently uh, uh, got divorced, and so she called her diet the "New Guys Are Going to See Me Naked" diet. And I just thought that was so funny. So Elaine Boozler, I don't know whatever happened to her, but very funny stand-up female comedian.
And then my last question, was there like just someone you didn't get? You just don't get it. You don't get why people think they're funny in the 70s.
Well, in the 70s, uh, again, I didn't understand the Andy Kaufman thing, but Johnny Carson kept bringing him back, and I kept watching it, and then then I figured it out. Uh, but as far as anybody else, I never really understood why people thought Shecky Green was funny, and and I guess you would have to watch some of his stuff, but I didn't understand why people thought he was funny, and oh, and there's some others too. You know, I Letterman was okay. I don't think he was the funniest guy. Same with Leno. I never really understood why those guys were in line to get talk shows when neither one of them were really that funny. Um, they were good talk show hosts, but I never really thought they were that funny as comedians.
Wait, was Johnny Carson a comedian before? Like first?
No, Johnny Carson was actually a radio announcer who happened to be in Hollywood. I think he was doing some voiceovers for commercials and stuff, and and he auditioned or was approached to do the Tonight Show, and well, he every night he had an opening monologue, which I guess could be considered to be stand-up comedy. Um, but he had writers, of course. Some of his material was his own, but he had writers. So um, I don't know if you would consider a talk show host doing a monologue the same as doing stand-up comedy. I guess you could call it the same thing. But no, Johnny Carson, to my knowledge, was not a comedian before he got that gig.
Man, I feel like there's so many people we're forgetting, like Nipsey Russell, Sammy Davis, like Richard Lewis. Like I just feel like we could keep going because like well, Andrew Dice Clay, he was more 80s, right?
Yeah, late '80s, and I he was another one that used profanity.
Yeah.
Uh, and he certainly wasn't in my wheelhouse or anything that I would want to listen to. Seinfeld, I think he was more in the '80s, but I think he was starting to make some waves in the late '70s. Um, but he was more in the 80s. And Seinfeld was popular because he had observational humor, where he would talk about different things and make you think, and and then maybe he would take it to a different boundary that was still acceptable, but just made you think even more. So Seinfeld was very successful because of that. Very surprised he didn't never got into movies or anything, but he had a successful TV show, so he didn't have to worry about making movies. And you're right there. Nipsey Russell, another funny guy, known for his poetry. Um, yeah, there's a lot of what I would call minor. I mean, there was major stand-up comedians, and then there was minor stand-up comedians, and there's a whole lot of them. I mean, we could talk. We could probably do another show. We don't have to, but we could probably do another show because there was just so many comedians in the '70s, but that so much a part of who I was because I enjoyed listening to my buddies talk about Steve Martin, and I think Kirk Tingblad, Johnny Bravo creator, was the person that kind of turned me on to Steve Martin because he would quote Steve Martin all the time by saying, "Hey, suck an egg," or or let's get small, or I'm a wild and crazy guy. And uh, there was just stuff like that, and you knew whenever, especially with Steve Martin, whenever somebody would say something, you knew they were quoting Steve Martin because he was the hot person at the time in 77, 78, 79. So uh, that was being in my high school years. Steve Martin was the guy that you tune in to watch when he was on The Tonight Show or Saturday Night Live or somebody else's variety show because he was the guy in the late 70s.
Yeah, because there's like a lot of people like I know like obviously there's oh, heck Jimmy Stewart, like Foster Brooks, like there's just so many like out there who is just like if you were a stand-up comedian, like people knew you. Um, because even well, I guess Kelsey Grammer, he wasn't really 70s, right? He was more so 80s.
Yeah, he wasn't a stand-up comedian though. He was an actor.
That's true. But like, well, geez, we didn't even touch Dean Martin. Like, I don't know what your research was last night, unless we did get on like everything that you want to talk about. But I am gonna like wrap this up. Is there anything else you want to say about stand-up comedians in the 70s for this week's episode?
Well, my only research, Andrew, was I just got on Google and or actually YouTube and typed in comedians of the '70s, and then all these bits started popping up because I didn't really remember a lot of the people we talked about on this episode. Um, and then when I just started thinking about all the people that were on Johnny Carson over the years, and that was sort of like my daily avenue since Carson was on 5 nights a week, 4 nights a week. That was a daily avenue to seeing a new comedian or an established comedian or a mediocre comedian. And then Saturday Night Live was on once a week, but that was a continuation of it into the weekend. Carson was on. Carson wasn't on Monday nights. He was on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you had Saturday Night Live. So there was always something to watch and always comedians to see. And once I started thinking about that last night, then all these names, I just started writing names down, and that's really the only research that I did.
Well, I appreciate your research. I appreciate your time. We appreciate your guys' time. Every time you click on YouTube and you listen to us and you watch us, well, I guess you just watch the video, but you more so listen to us. I wanted to do this for a while. We did talk about the D. Martin roast and like, oh, we should do an episode on that. But that would have just kind of put us like in a box. And I'm glad we were able to step outside the box and show some dedication and appreciation towards like all these comedians and like just how talented they were. Yes, you're watching on YouTube, so as soon as this episode's done, go listen to some of these names. Go watch some of the Ronnie Dangerfield as he's on Johnny Carson. Just make all these people laugh. I know you're not a Jonathan Winters fan. We did talk about him during our Scooby-Doo episode, Go watch the Jonathan Winters and Robin Williams on Johnny Carson. Like it's just there's so much fun comedians, and then especially in the 70s, Saturday Night Live. Watch that weird King Tut video. Comment below who your favorite comedian was of the 70s and what video that this podcast then made you want to go search later. I'm signing off from Orlando. I gotta go get some food or something. I'm pretty hungry. I'm gonna listen to some stand up. Brian, take us home.
Well, thanks for listening, and Andrew, I'm glad you mentioned Foster Brooks because I totally forgot about him too. What a wonderful talent he was playing a drunk guy, and Foster Brooks was 50 years old when he came up with the character of being a drunk stand-up comedian, and he did it so very, very well. So if you don't know who Foster Brooks is, Google him, watch some of the stuff he used to do, whether it be on the Dean Martin roast. He was a regular on the when Dean Martin used to have a variety show in the late 60s, early 70s. So he would be another one. To go and look up because it's just a wonderfully funny man. But thanks for listening. This is this episode, like last week with the candy bars. This has been a lot of fun, just kind of reminiscing about stand up comedians, and we're glad that you always tune in and listen, and and hopefully we're helping you trigger a memory or two about what you were doing in the 70s and remembering that time when you were a toddler, or maybe not a toddler, but in grade school or junior high or high school, or maybe even in first or second year of college. It was fun. It was a fun decade. It was a stressful decade, but all of them are. And but there was just a lot of memories, and we're really glad, Andrew and I, that we can bring you this that 70s pod so you can look back and remember. So have a good week, everyone, and we'll have another topic, another show for you next time.